The year was 1885, and the loneliness of the high plains was a physical thing, a weight that settled on Arthur McBride's shoulders as surely as his worn leather suspenders. It was in the endless sigh of the wind across the grama grass, in the vast, indifferent blue of the sky, and most of all, in the profound silence of his cabin after his 3 children were asleep. Grief, he had learned, was not a visitor. It was a tenant that had moved in the day he buried his wife, Martha, and it had never paid a cent of rent. His life was a litany of hard-bitten chores that began before the sun bruised the eastern horizon and ended long after it had bled out in the west. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts, a father, a rancher, a survivor. His small spread was pinched between the unforgiving rock of the mesas and the whisper of Navajo territory, a place most settlers avoided. But the land had been cheap, and with 3 mouths to feed, cheap was the only language Arthur could afford to speak. There was Clara, his eldest at 12, who had taken on the solemn gravity of a woman twice her age, her hands already chapped from lye soap and hard work. She was his shadow and his memory, a living echo of her mother's quiet competence. Henry, at 8, was a bundle of wiry energy and unanswered questions, his freckled face a constant map of curiosity and mischief. And then there was Rose, 5 years old, a sunbeam in the dusty corners of their life, whose laughter was the only currency that still held any real value. They were his reason and his burden, the anchors that kept him from drifting away on the tide of his own sorrow. His days were a rhythm of mending fences that the wind seemed determined to unravel, tending to a small herd of cattle whose ribs showed like counting beads, and coaxing a meager garden from the stubborn soil. He moved with a heavy deliberation, his body aching with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. He was a man running a race against the changing seasons, against failing equipment, and against the ever-present specter of not having enough. The stasis of his existence was a slow grind, a chipping away at the man he had once been, leaving behind a stoic shell that housed a hollowed-out heart. On a blistering afternoon in late summer, when the air shimmered with heat and the world seemed to hold its breath, Arthur rode out to check the northern boundary of his property. It was a desolate stretch where his land met a tangle of cedar and rock that spilled into the lands of the Daine, the Navajo people. He carried his rifle, more out of habit than expectation. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of his saddle and the buzz of a lone horsefly. It was a sound that broke the stillness, a sound that did not belong. It was not the cry of a coyote or the shriek of a hawk. It was a choked, guttural sound of pain, sharp and then muffled, as if bitten back. It came again, weaker this time. Arthur reined in his horse, every sense honed by years of solitude. He listened, his head cocked, his gaze sweeping the jagged terrain. He dismounted, tethering his horse to a juniper tree, and moved forward on foot, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. The sound led him to a narrow, shaded arroyo, a deep scar in the land. And there, in the dappled light, he saw her. She was on the ground, half hidden by overgrown sagebrush, a young Navajo woman. Her dark hair was a spill of polished jet against the pale dust, and her face, contorted in agony, was beautiful even in its distress. One of her legs was caught, horribly, in the rusted jaws of a bear trap. It was an old one, a cruel relic left by some long-gone trapper, forgotten until this terrible moment. It had clamped down high on her calf, the metal teeth sunk deep into flesh and bone. Blood stained her deerskin dress and pooled in the dust beneath her. For a long moment, Arthur stood frozen, the implications of the scene crashing down on him. A white man finding an injured Navajo woman on this contested border was a spark dangerously close to a powder keg. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to turn around, ride away, and pretend he had seen nothing. His children's faces flashed in his mind. He was their only protection. But then he looked at the woman. Her eyes, dark and fierce, met his. They were filled with defiance and unbearable pain, but not a shred of pleading. She was trying to pull her leg free, her hands slick with her own blood, a low gasp tearing from her throat with the effort. He could not leave her. The part of him that was Martha's husband, that was Clara's and Henry's and Rose's father, the part that was still a decent man despite all the world had done to him, would not allow it. He holstered his rifle, a deliberate gesture to show he meant no harm, and slowly raised his hands, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "I can help." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She stopped struggling and watched him, her body tense as a drawn bowstring, ready for a final, desperate fight. He saw the intricate silver and turquoise jewelry at her throat and wrists, the fine beadwork on her moccasins. She was not just any woman. There was an air of nobility about her, an undeniable pride that even this brutal agony could not extinguish. Arthur approached slowly, as he would a spooked horse. "The trap," he said, pointing. "I have to get it open." He knelt a cautious distance away, studying the mechanism. It was old and rusted tight. It would take all his strength to pry the jaws apart. "This is going to hurt," he said, more to himself than to her. He knew she likely didn't understand his words, but the tone, he hoped, conveyed his intent. He moved closer, his hands reaching for the release springs. She flinched, a hiss of pain and warning escaping her lips. He paused, his gaze meeting hers again. "Let me help," he repeated softly. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not trust, but a desperate acknowledgement of her own helplessness. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Putting his knee against the base of the trap for leverage, he gripped the cold, rusted steel. He pulled, his muscles straining, the cords in his neck standing out. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled into his eyes. The rust fought him, groaning in protest. The woman let out a sharp cry as the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her leg. Arthur gritted his teeth and pulled harder, pouring every ounce of his strength into the task. For a terrifying second, he thought it wouldn't budge. Then, with a loud crack, the jaws gave way, opening just enough. "Now," he grunted, and with his free hand, he carefully worked her leg out from between the metal teeth. The wound was grievous, a deep, mangled crescent of torn flesh. As soon as she was free, she collapsed back against the dirt, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her fierce pride finally broken by a wave of shock and pain. Arthur knew she couldn't walk. Leaving her here was still a death sentence. Coyotes, infection, the unforgiving sun, they would finish what the trap had started. There was only one choice, and it was the one that led straight back to his home, straight back to his children, bringing this dangerous new reality with him. He tore a strip from his own shirt, creating a makeshift bandage to try and slow the bleeding. As he gently wrapped the wound, her head lolled to the side, and she lost consciousness. He carried her back to his horse, his arms straining with the unexpected weight. She was light, but it was a dead weight, and the journey back to the cabin felt miles longer than the journey out. He managed to get her situated in front of him on the saddle, her head resting against his chest. Her breath was shallow against his shirt. As he rode, he felt like a man who had just picked up a lightning bolt, unsure of where or when it would choose to strike. The children were playing in the yard when he rode in. They stopped, their mouths falling open at the sight of the unconscious woman in their father's arms. Clara's face tightened with worry, while Henry's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Little Rose hid behind her sister's skirt. "Clara, get the door," Arthur commanded, his voice tight. "Henry, fetch me the clean cloths from the chest and a bucket of water from the well, now." They scrambled to obey, their childish games forgotten. Arthur carried the woman inside and laid her gently on his own cot, the only proper bed in the small two-room cabin. The space suddenly felt crowded, charged with a new, potent energy. He worked quickly, his movements economical and sure. He cut away the blood-soaked part of her dress to expose the wound. It was worse than he'd thought. The teeth had torn deep. Clara returned with a basin of water and clean linen, her face pale but her hands steady. She stood beside him, a silent apprentice. "Is she?" Clara started, her voice a whisper. "She's alive," Arthur said, "but she's hurt bad." Together, they cleaned the wound as best they could. Arthur knew enough about animal injuries to know that a wound like this, left by dirty, rusted metal, was a breeding ground for poison in the blood. He found the small bottle of carbolic acid he kept for doctoring livestock and, after a moment's hesitation, diluted it and used it to disinfect the injury. The woman moaned in her unconscious state, but did not wake. He bound the leg tightly with clean cloths, his touch surprisingly gentle. For the rest of the evening, an uneasy quiet settled over the cabin. The woman, whose name he did not know, drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Arthur sat in a chair beside the cot, watching her, the rifle now resting against the wall nearby. He was acutely aware of what he had done. He had brought a part of the wild, unknown world across his threshold. He had invited trouble to sit at his hearth. He could feel the judgment of his neighbors in the town 10 miles away, could hear their whispers already. Got himself mixed up with an Indian. The children were quiet, their usual evening chatter silenced. They ate their simple supper of beans and cornbread without a word, their eyes darting between their father and the still figure on the cot. Later, as Arthur tucked Rose into the small bed she shared with Clara, she looked up at him, her blue eyes wide. "Is the pretty lady going to wake up, Papa?" "I hope so, Sweet Pea," he whispered, his heart aching. "I surely hope so." He sent Henry and Clara to bed and resumed his vigil. The woman's fever rose through the night. He bathed her forehead with cool water, forcing spoonfuls of broth between her dry lips when she stirred. In the flickering lamplight, he studied her face. It was a strong face, with high cheekbones and a proud, firm jaw. Even in the depths of her fever, there was an indomitable quality to her. He found himself wondering about her life, her family, the world she came from that was so close and yet so alien to his own. He was tending to a stranger, yet he felt a strange, protective bond forming, forged in the violence of her rescue and the shared vulnerability of this long, quiet night. He must have dozed off, for he awoke with a start to the first grey light of dawn. The woman was awake. Her dark eyes were open, clear of fever, and fixed on him. The suspicion was still there, but it was tempered with a weary curiosity. She pushed herself up slightly, wincing as she moved her injured leg. "Desba," she said, her voice a low, musical rasp. She touched her own chest. "Arthur," he replied, touching his. It was their first exchange, a simple offering of names across a vast cultural divide. He brought her a cup of water, and she drank it gratefully. The silence that followed was not as tense as before. It was a silence of observation, of two people taking measure of one another in the pale morning light. It was Henry who saw them first. He had gone out to the privy and came running back inside, his face ashen. "Papa," he hissed, his voice trembling. "Papa, come quick." Arthur was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle. He moved to the door and peered out. His blood ran cold. The horizon, which had been empty moments before, was now dark with them. Warriors, dozens of them on horseback, sitting motionless, their figures stark silhouettes against the rising sun. They were armed with rifles and bows, their faces painted, their presence a silent, overwhelming threat. At their head sat an older man with a face like a carved rock, his bearing regal and commanding. He wore a headdress of eagle feathers that signified great authority. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The lightning bolt was about to strike. He glanced back at Desba. She had pulled herself to a sitting position, and there was a look of alarm on her face. "My children," Arthur said, his voice low and urgent, gesturing them to the back room. "Stay there. Do not make a sound." Clara, her eyes wide with terror, herded her younger siblings away from the door, her own fear secondary to her duty to protect them. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He could not show fear. He was a father protecting his home. He leaned his rifle against the inside of the doorframe, where he could reach it, but it was not in his hands, and stepped out onto the porch. He stood there alone, a solitary figure in a worn work shirt, facing a small army. The riders did not move. They simply watched him, their collective gaze a heavy, palpable force. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the yard. The air was thick with a silence that screamed. Finally, the leader, the man with the eagle feathers, urged his horse forward, halting just beyond the crude fence that marked Arthur's yard. He was followed by 2 other warriors, who stopped a few paces behind him. The chief's eyes, dark and piercing, scanned everything. They took in the small, weathered cabin, the scrawny chickens scratching in the dust, the patched roof. They lingered on the open doorway, and then they settled on Arthur. It was a gaze that seemed to peel back a man's skin and look right into his soul, weighing his worth, judging his spirit. Arthur met the gaze and held it, his posture straight, his hands loose at his sides. He would not be the first to look away. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The tension was a physical coil in Arthur's gut. He thought of his children huddled inside, of Martha, of the promise he'd made to keep them safe. He had brought this upon them with a single act of compassion. He braced himself for the accusation, for the demand, for the violence he was sure was coming. Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Desba stood there, leaning heavily on the doorframe. She had fashioned a crude crutch from a broken chair rung. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright and clear. She looked at the chief, and a torrent of Navajo words spilled from her lips. Her voice was strong, carrying across the silent yard. She spoke for a long time, her hands gesturing toward the arroyo where he'd found her, toward her bandaged leg, and then toward Arthur. The chief, who Arthur now understood must be her father, listened without interruption. His stern expression did not change, but his eyes shifted from his daughter back to Arthur, and this time the look was different. It was less a judgment and more a deep, searching assessment. When Desba finished speaking, she remained in the doorway, a silent witness to what would happen next. The chief, whose name Arthur would later learn was Hosteen, spoke for the first time. His voice was deep, like the rumble of distant thunder. He spoke in his own tongue, and one of the warriors beside him translated into halting, heavily accented English. "She is Desba, my daughter," the translator said, his eyes hard. "She says you freed her from the Iron Tooth. She says you brought her to your home, that you cleaned her wound, that you gave her water." Arthur simply nodded, his throat too dry to speak. Hosteen spoke again, a longer stream of words. The translator listened, then turned back to Arthur. "Our trackers followed the trail. We found the trap. We found your boot prints next to her blood. We came expecting to find her body and to take payment for it from you and your children." A cold dread washed over Arthur. He had been right to be afraid. That had been their intent. He stood his ground. The chief's gaze fell upon the neatly wrapped bandage on Desba's leg, visible in the doorway. He looked at Arthur's home again, seeing it differently now, not as the hovel of an intruder, but as the shelter that had saved his child. He saw the poverty, the struggle, the evidence of a hard life. And he saw the man who, despite having every reason to fear them, had chosen kindness. Hosteen spoke a final time, his voice softer, laced with a tone of authority that required no translation. The translator's expression was one of clear disbelief. He hesitated, as if unsure how to phrase the words. "Our law demands that a life debt be honored," he said slowly. "You have saved the daughter of a chief. This creates a debt that cannot be ignored. My chief, he does not wish to be in debt to a white man." Arthur braced himself. He expected an offer of horses, perhaps blankets, the traditional currency of such transactions. It would be a welcome relief, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem of his life, the crushing, relentless loneliness and the struggle to keep his family from starving. "He sees you are a man alone with your children," the translator continued, his voice heavy with the weight of the message. "He sees your herd is thin and your fields are dry. The winter will be hard for you." The translator paused, looking from his chief to Arthur. My chief, Hosteen, makes you this offer. My people will give you 20 head of cattle and 10 sacks of corn. We will ensure no harm comes to you or your family from our lands. We will consider the debt paid." Arthur's mind reeled. It was a fortune, it was survival, it was more than he could have dreamed of. A wave of relief so profound, it almost buckled his knees washed over him. I accept," he managed to say. "Thank you." But the translator held up a hand. "That is the first part of the offer. There is a condition." Arthur's hope faltered. Of course there was. "My daughter's leg is badly injured. She cannot ride. To move her now would risk the poison taking hold or the bone healing crooked. It is a journey of 2 days back to our camp. She needs to stay where she is, to heal where she is safe." The translator's gaze was intense. "The offer stands only if you allow Desba to remain in your care, under your roof, until she is strong enough to return to us. You will protect her as you have already done. You will give her shelter. In return, you will have our protection and our provision. The debt will be honored through this shared responsibility." It was an offer that would change everything. It was not just about cattle and corn. It was about weaving his life, however temporarily, into the fabric of theirs. It meant defying every prejudice he had ever known and inviting the scorn of his own people. It meant this strange, proud, beautiful woman would remain in his home, in the center of his solitary life. He looked from the implacable face of the chief to the doorway where Desba stood watching him, her dark eyes holding a question he could not yet decipher. He thought of the long, empty evenings, the silent meals, the heavy weight of his grief. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something other than loss. It was not quite hope, but it was its cousin. It was possibility. He was being offered more than survival. He was being offered a reprieve from the crushing isolation that had defined his world. Arthur McBride, the struggling single dad, the lonely widower, looked at the Navajo chief and gave a single, firm nod. "She can stay," he said, his voice clear and steady. "She will be safe here." A look of profound relief crossed Desba's face. Chief Hosteen watched Arthur for a long moment more, and then, for the first time, he inclined his head in a gesture of respect. He gave a sharp command, and the warriors, who had been a wall of silent menace, began to turn their horses, their movements fluid and controlled. They flowed back toward the horizon, leaving only the chief and a handful of others behind. The next few weeks fell into a new, unfamiliar rhythm. True to Hosteen's word, 2 young Navajo men delivered a small herd of healthy cattle the next day, their horns glinting in the sun, along with sacks of corn and dried beans that filled Arthur's depleted larder. The threat of the coming winter receded, replaced by a sense of security he hadn't felt in years. But the more significant change was inside the cabin. Desba's presence filled the silence. As her legs slowly healed, she moved from the cot to a chair by the hearth, her hands never idle. She showed Clara how to weave intricate patterns with dyed grasses, her long, graceful fingers moving with a mesmerizing skill. She taught Henry the names of the birds in her own language, her voice a soft melody that warmed the small room. She had a special affinity for little Rose, who would sit at her feet for hours, listening to stories of Coyote and the Star Dancers. Stories that painted a world of magic and wonder over the drab canvas of their lives. Arthur found himself watching her constantly. He watched the way the firelight caught the silver in her bracelets, the way she smiled at his children, a rare, beautiful thing that transformed her proud face. Communication remained a challenge, a patchwork of gestures, single words, and the surprising translations offered by Clara, who seemed to have a natural gift for understanding. But they began to communicate on a deeper level in the shared language of work and care. He would come in from the fields, weary and covered in dust, and find a hot meal waiting, not just his usual beans, but something she had prepared, adding wild herbs she'd instructed Henry to find. She mended their clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She was bringing order and a quiet beauty back into a home that had long been bereft of both. One evening, after the children were asleep, they sat in the quiet glow of the fire. Arthur was cleaning a piece of tack, his hands moving with familiar purpose. Desba was polishing one of her silver bracelets with a soft cloth. "Your wife," she said, her English still hesitant but improving daily. "Clara, she speaks of her." Arthur's hands stilled. He rarely spoke of Martha. The pain was still too close to the surface. He looked into the flames, his throat tight. "Her name was Martha," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. She was like Clara, kind and strong. The fever took her 2 years ago." Desba was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke softly. "I lost my mother when I was a girl, a sickness that came with the winter. My father, he became like the mountain, hard and silent. Grief makes a stone of a man's heart." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound understanding that transcended words. "But a stone can be warmed by the sun." In that moment, Arthur felt a crack appear in the wall he had built around himself. She saw him, not just as a settler, not just as a father, but as a man hollowed by loss. He saw her not as a Navajo princess or a stranger, but as a woman who knew the same deep sorrow. The isolation he had carried for so long began to feel a little less absolute. As the weeks turned into a month, her leg grew stronger. She could walk with only a slight limp. The day was approaching when her people would come for her. The thought left a strange, hollow ache in Arthur's chest. He had grown used to her presence, to the sound of her voice, to the way the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. One afternoon he found her by the creek, watching Rose chase dragonflies. She stood with a stillness that was part of her nature, a deep connection to the land that he, for all his work upon it, had never felt. "My father will send for me soon," she said, not looking at him. "I know," he replied, his voice quiet. She turned to face him then. "In my world, a home is made by a woman's hands and a man's strength, together. This place, it was a shelter. Now, it is becoming a home." She paused, her gaze steady and direct. "You are a good man, Arthur McBride. Your heart is not made of stone." He didn't know what to say. He could only look at her, at this woman who had been brought to him by a cruel twist of fate, who had endured terrible pain and had repaid it with grace and kindness. He saw the life she had brought back to his home, to his children, and to him. The thought of her leaving was like imagining the sun failing to rise. The day Hosteen and his warriors returned, the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. They did not arrive as a threat, but as an escort. Arthur stood on his porch once more, but this time he was not alone. Desba stood beside him, and his children were clustered near, their faces sad. Hosteen dismounted and approached, his eyes moving between his daughter and Arthur. He saw his daughter was whole and strong again. He saw the healthy cattle grazing on the hill. He saw the look in Arthur's eyes as he gazed at Desba. He spoke to his daughter in their tongue, his voice soft. She replied, her voice clear and firm. She looked at Arthur, then back to her father, and spoke again, a longer speech this time, her tone earnest and full of conviction. Hosteen listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he looked at Arthur for a long, silent minute. Then he spoke to him directly, without a translator, in slow, carefully chosen English. "You have honored the debt," the chief said. "My daughter is healed. You have our thanks." He paused. "She tells me her spirit wishes to stay in this place. She says her home is no longer with us, but here, with you and your children." Arthur's heart stopped. He looked at Desba, who met his gaze with a quiet, hopeful courage. He saw his own future reflected in her eyes, a future that was not empty and silent, but filled with her strength, her warmth, her love. The chief's gaze was piercing. "This is not our way, but my daughter's heart is strong, stronger than my own. If she is to stay, she will not stay as a guest. She will stay as a wife, as the mother of this house." He looked at Arthur, his question unspoken but hanging heavy in the air. This was not an offer of cattle or corn. This was an offer of a life, a family, a future. Arthur McBride looked at the proud chief. He looked at Clara, Henry, and Rose, who were watching him with pleading eyes. And then he looked at Desba, the Navajo woman he had found broken and trapped, who had, in turn, rescued him from a prison of his own. He reached out and took her hand, her fingers curled around his, warm and strong. "Yes," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion, "she is already home." A slow smile spread across Hostein's weathered face. He had not lost a daughter, he had forged an alliance stronger than any treaty, a family bound not by blood or by law, but by an unexpected act of kindness in the heart of the vast, unforgiving West. The land was still hard, and life would still be a struggle, but for the first time since he had laid Martha to rest, Arthur McBride did not have to face it alone. He had a home again. The year was 1885, and the land held its breath. It was a territory of jagged rock and thirsty earth, where the sun baked the silence into the ground and the wind carried the ghosts of forgotten languages. This was the world Lonan inhabited, a world he had chosen because it was as broken and solitary as he was. He was a man caught between two currents, his father's white blood warring with the Apache blood of his mother, a conflict that had left him an outcast from the only people he had ever called his own. His tribe, the people, had exiled him years ago. It was not one single act, but the slow accretion of mistrust. He looked too much like the men who surveyed their land for railroads, his eyes a shade too light, his features a compromise that satisfied no one. They called him Indar Wigai, the White Apache. A name that was not a description, but a verdict. So he had left before they could cast him out, taking his skill as a scout and tracker into a self-imposed exile, a quiet vanishing. He became a whisper in the canyons, a shadow on the mesas, a man who spoke more to his horse and the hawks than to any human. His life was a spare and disciplined ritual. He rose before the sun painted the eastern cliffs in hues of rose and ochre, his movements economical and silent. He hunted, not for sport, but for sustenance. He tanned the hides, mended his own worn buckskins, and read the story of the land in a way no one in the bustling, dusty towns could ever comprehend. A bent twig, a scuff in the sand, the flight pattern of a startled quail, these were his letters, his words, his only conversations. The grief of his rejection had settled deep in his bones, a permanent ache like an old wound that throbbed when the weather turned. It had hardened him, glazing his spirit with a stoic calm that few would ever dare to penetrate. He had built a small, defensible camp in a shallow box canyon, a place with a reliable seep of water and a single, narrow entrance he could watch from the high ground. It was not a home. A home was a place of belonging, of shared warmth and voices. This was merely a place to exist, a fortress against a world that had no space for him. He was a man hollowed out by loneliness, living a life of profound resignation, waiting for nothing in particular. It was on a day scorched by the late summer heat that the rhythm of his solitude was shattered. He was tracking a mountain lion that had grown too bold, its prints leading him north toward the old wagon trail, a route mostly abandoned for the safer passage closer to the forts. The air grew still, heavy with an unnatural silence. Even the insects seemed to have ceased their buzzing. Then he smelled it, the acrid stench of smoke, not from a clean campfire, but the greasy, foul smell of total destruction. He tethered his horse in a copse of mesquite and moved forward on foot, his moccasins making no sound on the rocky soil. He crested a low rise and saw the source. It was a single wagon, or what was left of it. It lay on its side like a slaughtered beast, its canvas cover burned away to skeletal hoops of scorched wood. The ground around it was a chaotic mess of splintered crates, strewn clothing, and the dark, still shapes of the two draft horses, arrows bristling from their thick hides. Two human forms lay near the wreckage, a man and a woman, unmoving under the indifferent glare of the sun. It was the aftermath of a raid, swift and brutal. Lonan felt nothing. It was the way of this land. Violence was a part of its grammar. He observed with the detached eye of a scout, noting the unshod hoofprints of a dozen Poniesa raiding party, likely young men seeking status, not a formal war band. He was about to turn away, to retreat back into his isolated existence and let the desert reclaim its own, when he heard it. It was not a cry of pain or a shout of terror. It was a thin, wavering whimper, a sound so small and fragile it was nearly lost in the vastness. It was the sound of a life that refused to be extinguished. His body tensed. He scanned the scene again, his eyes moving past the tragedy to search for the source. The sound came again, slightly stronger this time, from within the overturned wagon bed, beneath a pile of singed blankets. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. This was not his concern. It was a white family's tragedy, and he was no part of their world. To involve himself was to invite complication, danger, and the very prejudice he had spent years avoiding. But the sound persisted. It was a hook in his conscience, pulling him forward against his will. He moved cautiously toward the wreckage, his rifle held ready, though he knew the raiders were long gone. He reached the wagon and peered into the shadowed interior. There, tucked inside a splintered wooden crate that had miraculously protected it from the worst of the chaos, was a baby. It was wrapped in a simple flannel cloth, its face red and blotchy from crying, its tiny fists balled up in distress. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its hair was a fluff of pale gold, and when it opened its eyes, they were the color of the sky just before a storm. A white child, the ultimate symbol of the world that had pushed him away. He stared down at the infant, a battle raging within him. He could walk away. In an hour, the sun or a coyote would finish what the raiders had started. No one would ever know. Or he could take it to the nearest settlement, a place like dusty Prescott, and leave it on the church steps. But that was a 2-day ride, and he knew how they would look at him, an Apache, or near enough, with a white baby. They would see a kidnapper, a murderer. They would ask questions he couldn't answer, and their judgment would be swift and merciless. The baby let out another cry, a raw, desperate plea for life. In that sound, Lonan heard an echo of his own profound isolation. This child was now as much of an outcast as he was parentless, tribeless, utterly alone in a hostile world. He reached down, his calloused, scarred hands, surprisingly gentle as he lifted the small, warm bundle from the wreckage. The baby, startled by the movement, went quiet, its wide, blue eyes fixing on his face with an unnerving intensity. In that moment, the wall Lonan had built around his heart developed its first crack. He had made his choice, or perhaps the choice had been made for him. He turned his back on the carnage and walked toward his horse, carrying the future in his arms. The first days were a clumsy dance of survival. Lonan, a man who could track a whisper on the wind and read the age of a footprint in hard-packed dirt, was utterly inept at caring for a human infant. The baby's cries were a language he did not understand, a constant, piercing signal of needs he could only guess at. Hunger, pain, loneliness. He tried offering it water from his canteen, which it choked on. He mashed up some cooked rabbit meat with jerky, a gesture of desperation that only made the crying louder. He felt a rising tide of frustration and despair. He had taken on this burden, and now he was failing it. He sat by his fire on the second night, the baby wailing in a makeshift cradle he had fashioned from a leather pannier. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a raw nerve in the vast, silent dark. Lonan felt the urge to scream with it, to match its helpless fury with his own. He was a fool. This was a mistake. But in the morning, guided by a half-remembered fragment of his mother's wisdom, he located a small herd of wild goats. It took him half a day of silent, patient stalking to isolate a nanny and her kid. With a skill born of necessity, he captured the nanny, a rangy, wild-eyed creature that fought him with every ounce of its strength. He tied her securely and, after a dozen failed attempts, managed to squeeze a thin stream of milk into a tin cup. He brought the cup to the baby, dipping his finger into the warm, musky liquid and touching it to the infant's lips. The crying stopped. A tiny, seeking mouth latched onto his finger, sucking with a surprising, desperate strength. Lonan held his breath, watching the small, fragile life drawing sustenance from his hand. He refilled his finger again and again, a slow, tedious process, until the baby's eyelids grew heavy and, with a final, contented sigh, it fell asleep. Lonan slumped back against a rock, exhausted but filled with a strange, fierce sense of triumph. He had kept it alive for another day. He looked at the sleeping child, its face peaceful in the dappled sunlight. He still saw it as a thing, a responsibility. He had yet to allow himself to see the person within the bundle. His interactions remained functional, guarded. He changed its soiled cloths, washed it with a damp rag, and held it only when necessary. He kept a deliberate distance, a space between his own wounded heart and this new, vulnerable one. He spent his days in a state of hypervigilance, watching, listening, assessing. The baby was a loud, fragile liability in a world where silence meant safety. Yet, as the days turned into a week, then two, a new rhythm began to establish itself. The frantic cries of the first days softened into more readable signals. Lonan learned the cry of hunger from the cry of discomfort. He learned that the baby sometimes just needed to be held, to feel the steady beat of another heart against its own. He found himself talking to it, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't speak English, the language of his father and the men in the towns. He spoke Apache, the words of his mother, the language of the earth and the sky. He told the baby about the hawk circling overhead, about the way the light changed on the canyon walls, about the stories hidden in the stars. The baby, of course, did not understand the words, but it seemed to respond to the low, steady cadence of his voice, gurgling and cooing in the quiet moments between his sentences. One afternoon, as Lonan sat mending a rein, the baby lay on a soft rabbit pelt nearby. It had been watching him, its blue eyes tracking his every movement. He glanced down, and for the first time, the baby's face broke into a wide, toothless smile. It was a moment of pure, uncalculated joy. It struck Lonan with the force of a physical blow, bypassing all his defenses and landing directly in the hollow space in his chest. He froze, the leather rein slipping from his grasp. He had not been smiled at in a decade. He had forgotten what it felt like. He slowly reached out a hand, and the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around his index finger, holding on with a grip that felt as strong as an anchor. In that small, simple connection, something shifted irrevocably inside him. This was no longer an it. This was a person, a boy, his boy. He needed a name, not a white man's name from the world that had created and then abandoned him. He needed a name that belonged to this new life they were forging together in the wilderness. He looked at the boy, his pale hair shining like corn silk in the sun, his spirit a small, bright flame that had refused to be put out. He thought of the light that follows a storm, the hope that comes after despair. Ashki, he whispered, the Navajo word for boy, feeling right on his tongue. It was simple, it was fundamental, but then he added another, a private name, an Apache name. Tsego, he said softly, he who survived. From that day forward, Lonan's purpose was no longer simply to endure, it was to protect. The boy, whom he began to think of as Isaac when he imagined the world beyond their canyon, became the center of his universe. He taught him not with words, but with actions. He showed him how to be quiet and watch the deer come to the seep to drink. He let him touch the rough bark of the cottonwood trees and the smooth, cool surface of river stones. He carved him a small wooden bird that he could hold in his hand. He made a new, more secure carrier for the boy, one he could strap to his own back, allowing them to move as one. He began exploring further from their canyon, always with Isaac nestled safely against him, a warm weight that was both a comfort and a constant reminder of his new, terrifyingly precious responsibility. The silence of his life had been broken, not just by the baby's cries and coos, but by the reawakening of his own heart. The loneliness was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer absolute. He had found a tribe of two, a small flicker of belonging in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. 2 years passed. The land shaped the boy as it had shaped Lonan. Isaacus Lonan now called him in his own thoughts, a bridge to a world he still kept at bay grew from a helpless infant into a sturdy toddler. His hair remained a shock of pale gold against his sun-darkened skin, and his eyes were still a startling blue, but he moved with a quiet confidence that was all Lonan's teaching. He knew the difference between the call of a canyon wren and a pinyon jay. He could walk barefoot on the rocky ground without flinching. He knew which berries were safe to eat and which plants would sting his fingers. His first word was not da, but a child's approximation of the Apache word for water. Their life in the Box Canyon was an idyll of isolation, a secret world they had built together. But Lonan knew it couldn't last. The world outside was encroaching. The glint of prospectors' pans was appearing in more streams, and the distant sounds of blasting for the railroad echoed through the mountains on still days. The sanctuary he had built was fragile, its walls made of nothing more than solitude and distance. The intrusion came, as he always knew it would, without warning. He had been teaching Isaac how to track a lizard in the sand near the mouth of their canyon when he heard the clatter of shod horses on stone. It was a sound that did not belong. He scooped Isaac into his arms in one fluid motion, pressing a hand gently over the boy's mouth and melting back into the shadows of the canyon wall. 2 men rode into view. They were prospectors, by the look of them bearded, dusty, and carrying the weary, avaricious look of men who spent their lives chasing glimmers in the dirt. One was thick-set and rode with a slouch. The other was leaner, with a cruel twist to his mouth and cold, assessing eyes. His name, Lonan would later learn, was Callahan. "Told you there was water back in here," the stocky one said, his voice a gravelly intrusion in the quiet air. "Saw the green from the ridge." They dismounted, letting their horses drink from the seep. Callahan's gaze swept the canyon, his eyes sharp and practiced. They missed nothing. He saw the tidy camp, the neatly stacked firewood, the small tanned hide of a rabbit stretched on a frame. And then he saw the toy small wooden bird Lonan had carved, which Isaac had dropped in his haste. Callahan walked over and picked it up, turning it over in his grimy hands. "Well now, look at this. Someone's living here, and they got a kid." His eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows. An Injun, most likely. No white man would live this rough. Lonan's heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He held Isaac tighter, the boy's small body rigid against his own. He willed them to be invisible, to be nothing more than a part of the rock. "Come on out," Callahan shouted, his voice bouncing off the rock walls. "We ain't gonna hurt you, just want to water our horses." Lonan remained still, a statue carved from shadow. Silence was his best defense. But Isaac, frightened and confused, began to squirm, letting out a small, muffled whimper against his hand. It was enough. Callahan's head snapped in their direction. His eyes, accustomed to spotting the subtle signs of gold, fixed on the subtle disruption in the pattern of the shadows. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be. Got a shy one." He took a step forward. "And what's that you got with you? A papoose?" Slowly, knowing there was no other choice, Lonan stepped out from the shadows, positioning himself between the men and his son. He held Isaac behind him, shielding the boy from their view. He said nothing, his face an impassive mask. The 2 prospectors stared, their jaws slack with astonishment. They saw a man who defied their categories, the build and bearing of an Apache warrior, but with features that were an unsettling blend. And then Isaac peeked out from behind Lonan's leg, a small boy with a tumble of blonde hair and bright blue eyes. The stocky man's eyes went wide. "Sweet Lord, Callahan, that's a white kid." Callahan's smile vanished, replaced by a look of hard suspicion. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Where'd you get the boy, Injun?" he demanded, his hand moving to rest on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. Lonan's own hand instinctively tightened on the knife at his belt. He kept his voice low and even, speaking in the halting English he despised. "He is mine." Callahan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Yours? You steal him? Did you kill his folks? We heard about that wagon raid up north a couple years back. Was that you?" "He is my son," Lonan repeated, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He was stating a truth these men could never comprehend. Their world was built on lines of color and blood, lines he had spent his life being punished for crossing. "You're a liar," Callahan sneered, taking another step forward. "That boy ain't yours. He needs to be with his own kind. We'll take him into town, see he gets to a proper home." He saw it all in a flash, the hero's welcome, the reward, the story they could tell for years about how they rescued a white child from a savage half-breed. "You will not," Lonan said. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unmoving as the canyon walls around them. "We'll see about that," Callahan said, his hand now gripping his pistol. "Give us the boy, or we'll take him." Lonan knew this was a fight he couldn't win with force. There were two of them, both armed. His only chance was to use the land, the one ally he had ever had. He backed away slowly, pulling Isaac with him deeper into the canyon. "Leave," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "This is not your place." Callahan and his partner exchanged a look. They had the upper hand and they knew it. "We'll be back for him," Callahan promised, his voice full of chilling certainty. "Don't you worry about that. A boy like that belongs in a white world." They mounted their horses and rode out of the canyon, leaving a toxic silence in their wake. Lonan stood for a long time, listening until the sound of their hoofbeats faded completely. He looked down at Isaac, who was staring up at him, his small face a mirror of confusion and fear. Lonan knelt and pulled him into a fierce embrace. The sanctuary was breached. The world had found them, and it was coming to tear them apart. That night, there was no peace. Lonan did not build a fire. He sat in the cold darkness, Isaac asleep in his arms, his senses stretched to their breaking point. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep, every rustle of a nocturnal animal like the cocking of a hammer. He knew Callahan would be back. Men like that were fueled by greed and a self-righteous cruelty that they mistook for justice. They would not simply ride away. He had to leave. This place, his home for 2 years, was no longer safe. But he couldn't just run. They would track him. He had to be smarter. He had to use their arrogance and their ignorance against them. He was a scout. He was a hunter. And tonight, he would be the prey that set its own traps. He spent the hours before dawn making his preparations. He packed their few essentials into a single leather bag: dried meat, the tin cup, a water skin, the rabbit pelt blanket. He worked silently, his movements precise and purposeful. He looked around the small camp, the only home Isaac had ever known, and a wave of cold anger washed over him. These men were trying to steal not just his son, but their entire world. Just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, he heard them. The distant, faint clink of a horseshoe on rock. They were coming, as he knew they would. He strapped Isaac securely to his back, whispering to him in Apache, his voice calm and reassuring, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Be still, my son. Be quiet as the stone. We are the wind now." He did not run for the mouth of the canyon. Instead, he began to climb. He moved toward the steep, treacherous back wall, a sheer face of rock that looked impassable. But Lonan knew its secrets. He knew every handhold, every narrow ledge, a path he had scouted long ago for just such an emergency. It was a goat's path, a spider's climb, a route no sane man would attempt, let alone with a child on his back. He was halfway up when Callahan and his partner rode into the canyon below, their rifles drawn. They stormed the empty camp, kicking over the cold fire pit. their voices echoing with curses when they found it deserted. "He's run for it," the stocky man yelled, pointing toward the canyon's mouth. "Let's go. He can't have gotten far with the kid." "Wait," Callahan commanded, his sharp eyes scanning the area. He was smarter than his partner. He saw the tracks leading away from the camp, but they were too obvious, too clear. A man like their quarry wouldn't be so careless. Callahan's gaze lifted, sweeping the canyon walls. From his perch high above, Lonan froze. He flattened himself against the rock, trying to merge with it, Isaac's small body pressed tight against him. For a heart-stopping moment he thought Callahan had seen him. The prospector's gaze seemed to pass directly over their position, but the angle was steep, the morning light still deceptive. Callahan's eyes moved on. "He's playing games," Callahan snarled. "He's trying to trick us. Split up, you take the trail, I'll check the ridges." It was the mistake Lonan had been counting on. As the stocky man thundered out of the canyon, Callahan began to make his way up the more accessible slope opposite Lonan's position, hoping to get a better vantage point. Lonan waited, his patience absolute. He waited until Callahan was committed, high on the ridge and separated from his partner. Then Lonan continued his climb. He moved with a terrifying speed and silence, not upward, but sideways, traversing a narrow, crumbling ledge that led to a deep fissure in the rock face. He slipped inside, into the cool, dark belly of the mountain. From a small opening, he could watch Callahan on the opposite ridge, a small figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Now, he set his trap. He had gathered what he needed on his way up: loose stones, a length of rawhide cord, a dry, dead branch. He worked quickly, using his knowledge of leverage and balance. He found a large, precariously balanced boulder at the top of a steep scree slope that funneled down toward the path Callahan had taken. He anchored one end of his rawhide to the boulder and the other to the dead branch, jamming it into a crack in the rock. It was a simple trigger. A sharp pull on the branch would dislodge the boulder, starting a rock slide. It wasn't designed to kill, but to block, to terrify, to close the door behind him. He waited. He could hear Callahan shouting in frustration from the opposite ridge, unable to find any sign of them. He heard the partner ride back into the canyon, his voice echoing. "Nothing. He's vanished." "He's here somewhere," Callahan yelled back, his voice raw with fury. "He's an animal. He can't have just." It was time. Lonan took a deep breath. He looked down at Isaac, whose wide eyes were fixed on his. He saw not fear but trust, absolute trust. It gave him all the strength he needed. He moved back out onto the ledge and, with a powerful heave, pulled the trigger branch. There was a groan of stressed rock, then a tremendous crack. The boulder teetered for a second before plunging downward, striking the scree slope with immense force. It set off a chain reaction. A river of rock and gravel cascaded down the mountainside, a deafening roar that filled the canyon. It poured across the path below, a thundering, unstoppable avalanche of stone and dust. Callahan and his partner stared in horror as their only exit was sealed off by a massive, impassable wall of rubble. Dust filled the air, choking them. Their horses reared in terror. They were trapped. Lonan didn't wait to watch their reaction. He slipped away, moving along the high, hidden ledges of the canyon, putting distance between his family and the men who would destroy it. He did not look back. He had not killed them. He had simply used the mountain to protect its own. He had met their violence not with more violence, but with the wisdom of the earth itself. He moved through the wilderness like a ghost, carrying his son, his purpose, his entire world on his back, leaving the foiled hatred of men buried in a tomb of their own making. They traveled for weeks, moving north and west, into the high country where the air was thin and clean, and the world of men was a distant rumor. Lonan walked the ancient paths, his senses alive, teaching Isaac the whole way. He showed him how the aspen leaves trembled in the wind, how to find water by following the line of willows, how to listen to the language of the pines. They finally found their new home in a place that seemed to have been waiting for them. It was a small, hidden valley, cradled by towering granite peaks and fed by a spring that ran clear and cold all year round. A thick stand of pine and fir trees offered protection from the wind and prying eyes, and the valley floor was a lush meadow, rich with game and wild berries. It was a place of deep peace, a world away from the harsh, baked earth they had left behind. Here, they built a new life. Lonan constructed a small, sturdy cabin, not a temporary camp, but a real home, with a stone fireplace and a solid roof against the snows he knew would come. Isaac, now a boy of almost 3, helped in his own way, carrying small branches and handing his father tools, his face alight with the serious purpose of a child at work. The harsh, guarded silence that had defined Lonan for so long was gone, replaced by the sounds of their shared existence. The chop of his axe, the crackle of the fire, and above all, Isaac's laughter, a sound that filled the valley like birdsong. Lonan's Apache words were now answered by the boy's own attempts, a blend of languages that was uniquely theirs. One evening, as the sky bruised into a deep twilight and the first stars appeared like diamond dust, they sat before their home. Lonan was showing Isaac how to fashion a simple flute from a river reed. Isaac watched, his blue eyes intent, before taking the finished flute and producing a single, soft, breathy note. He looked up at Lonan and smiled, the same pure, unvarnished smile that had first broken through his father's defenses 2 years before. "Nata," Isaac said, his small hand resting on Lonan's arm. "My father." Lonan felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so profound it almost hurt. He looked at this boy, this child of a different blood, a different people, who had been abandoned by one world and saved by another. He had not stolen a child, he had been given one. The tribe that had exiled him, the world that had judged him, none of it mattered anymore. His identity was not defined by his mixed blood or by those who had rejected him. It was forged here, in this hidden valley, in his bond with this boy. He had been a man between worlds, belonging to none, but in rescuing Isaac, he had rescued himself. He had found his purpose not in vengeance or bitterness, but in creation. He had created a family. He had created a home. He had looked into the face of prejudice and despair and chosen to build a life founded on love and protection. He put his arm around his son, and together they watched the stars multiply, 2 solitary figures who had found their entire universe in each other, a tribe of 2, finally and truly home.